Hello. Welcome to the ABLE National Resource Center webinar on Social Security's updated ABLE guidance, a deeper dive. I'm Chris Rodriguez, Director of the ABLE National Resource Center, and I'll be your primary presenter today, excuse me. Before we get started, let's go ahead and go over some housekeeping. So it's important to note that the audio for today's webinar is being broadcast through your computer. Please make sure that your speakers are turned on and your headphones are plugged in. You can control the audio broadcast via the audio broadcast panel. If you accidentally close the panel, you can reopen it by going to the Communicate menu at the top of the screen and choosing Join Audio Broadcast. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer or would just like to prefer to listen by phone, you can dial using the information provided on the right hand of your screen, and that is also included in your registration confirmation email. Real-time captioning is provided during this webinar. The captions can be found in the Media Viewer panel, which appears in the lower right-hand corner of the webinar platform. If you want to make the Media Viewer panel larger, you can minimize other panels such as the chat, the Q&A, and/or the participants panel. In terms of submitting questions, please use the Q&A box to submit any questions you have during the webinar, and we will direct those questions accordingly during our Q&A portion of the webinar. If you are listening by phone and not logged into the webinar, you may also ask questions by emailing questions to KAUCHENBACH@ndi-inc.org. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and the materials will be placed on the ABLE National Resource Center at the following web address. During the webinar, if you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to send a message to the host NDI admin, or you may also email KAUCHENBACH@ndi-inc.org. Okay. So, again, I am Chris Rodriguez. I'm the Director of the ABLE National Resource Center, and I'll be the primary presenter today. I am happy to be joined by a group of very experienced panelists, including Marlene Ulinsky, who's our Social Security benefits expert at the National Disability Institute, with Jim Sheldon, who's the supervising attorney at National Assistive Technology Advocacy Project, Rob Percival, who's the Senior Vice President of Strategic Products at Ascensus College Savings, and Katie Oliver, who is an ABLE account owner and a member of our ABLE National Resource Center ABLE Advisors. Thank you all for participating and taking the time to lend your expertise to the webinar today. So just to quickly go over the agenda, what we'll be covering today in the next 90 minutes. We'll start out with a brief introduction to ABLE. We'll talk a little bit about the ABLE basics, or the basic characteristics that govern the ABLE programs and ABLE accounts. And then we're going to dive into what the meat of the webinar will be, and that will be taking a look at the Social Security Administration's recently updated POMs. These POMs have been divided into 7 different sections. And we'll be talking about those and what type of content is included in each of those sections. After that, we're going to introduce you to our ABLE case summary series, of which Mr. Jim Sheldon will be presenting. Then we'll have a quick slide giving more information about the ABLE National Resource Center and where you can find additional materials related to ABLE accounts and ABLE programs. And then we're going to open it up to a Q&A section, of which will be facilitated by the panel of our guest experts. So let's go ahead and get started here. So an introduction to ABLE. So what is ABLE exactly? Well, ABLE is the Stephen Beck Jr. Achieving a Better Life Experience, or ABLE Act, and it amends the federal tax code to add Section 529A. And what Section 529A does is it creates a new option for eligible people with disabilities to save money in a tax-exempt or a tax-advantaged savings account that can be used to help that individual purchase or pay for qualified disability-related expenses, while at the same time maintaining their eligibility for federally funded public benefits, such as Medicaid and SSI, Supplemental Security Income, of which we're going to be talking a lot about today. So just really quickly, some brief history behind the ABLE Act. It was signed into law in December of 2014 after nearly a decade of legislative history, meaning that it took about 8 years in order for this proposed piece of legislation to make it through the legislative process and then on to the President's desk and inevitably become law. By the time that it did make it through Congress, it had overwhelming bipartisan support both in the House and in the Senate. Additionally, the federal law, the ABLE Act, authorizes but does not require states to establish these ABLE programs, which then offer ABLE accounts to eligible people with disabilities. So while we do see an abundance of states who have decided to pass their own ABLE legislation, ABLE state legislation through their state legislatures, not all will actually be doing that and setting up ABLE accounts, but we are happy to report that today there are 35 states plus the District of Columbia that have actually passed ABLE legislation and gone forward to launch their ABLE programs and are accepting eligible individuals right now to open up an ABLE account with them. And most of those, a large majority of those states are actually accepting eligible individuals nationwide, meaning that you don't necessarily have to live in that state in order to participate in their ABLE program. That's important to note. And to date, there's probably about, we suspect, somewhere around 20,000 ABLE accounts open nationwide. So that's very exciting. But we do estimate that there's probably somewhere around 8 or so million people who are eligible. So obviously, we have plenty of room to grow, and I think one of the reasons why some people perhaps might be a little bit hesitant in getting involved is because they would like to learn more about how the funds in the ABLE account interact with federal means-tested benefits such as SSI, and that's just the topic we're going to be talking about today. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of the new SSA updated PALMs, let's talk just very briefly about some ABLE basics so that everybody is kind of on the same page here. So it's important to know that there are eligibility requirements related to being able to open up an ABLE account, and they speak to the age in which the individual first experienced his or her disability, and they also relate to the severity of that disability. And we'll talk about this in further detail here in a bit. Also, provided that you meet that eligibility criteria to be able to open up an account, you are not obligated to enroll in your state of residence. So we talked about that in the last slide. So as an example, if you happen to live in a state that does not have an ABLE account or ABLE program open right now, but you meet that eligibility, you can go and enroll in a different state's ABLE program. So my brother, his name is TJ, he meets all the eligibility criteria. He lives down in Texas. Texas is planning to open up an ABLE program, but haven't got to it quite yet. They're still figuring it out. They're still just kind of crossing the T's and dotting the I's. But that doesn't mean he couldn't go to another state and open up an ABLE program, provided that that state is enrolling nationwide, of which many programs are. Additionally, it's important to know that the designated beneficiary, that means the person with the disability, is the account owner. Now this is very important, and this differentiates ABLE accounts from other financial asset building tools that are used by people with disabilities, such as third-party special needs trusts, because it allows the person with a disability to have a newfound authority over the funds in their account. So they have a lot more autonomy and independence in terms of how those dollars are spent. Now, that being the case, there are still other individuals who can have what's called signature authority over the account in the circumstance in which the individual either does not have the capacity to oversee their own account, or perhaps if they just like to have help with it. And that type of individual that's allowed to have signature authority must be either the parent of the designated beneficiary if they're a minor, a guardian of the beneficiary if they are an adult, or if the designated beneficiary has the authority to do so, they can provide power of attorney to an individual and allow them to have that signature authority that gives them the right, or gives that other person the authority to exercise governance or oversight of the account on behalf of the designated beneficiary. But even in those circumstances, the designated beneficiary is still considered the account owner, so that's important. Additionally, funds in the account are meant to be used to help pay for what's called qualified disability-related expenses, and we'll talk about what that means here in a little bit. And assets in and distributions for qualified disability-related expenses will be disregarded or given special treatment when determining eligibility for most federal means-tested benefits. And we'll talk about why I say most as opposed to all, but the majority of this webinar was really going to concentrate around supplemental security income beneficiaries who are also ABLE account owners. Lastly, anybody can contribute into an individual's ABLE account. That means friends, family, the beneficiary themselves as a result of maybe earnings because of employment or an inheritance or things like that. They can contribute their own funds into their ABLE account as well. However, all those contributions combined from all the contributors in any given tax year are not to exceed $15,000. Okay, so that's important to note as well. Now, I did put a asterisk next to that because a new law just passed in mid-December that would actually allow the account owner to contribute above that $15,000 cap, provided that they have employment, but we're not going to get into that today. I would encourage folks to go to the ABLE National Resource Center to learn more about that. But this is just some basic characteristics of ABLE. Okay, so now that we have a little bit about the history, we have a little bit about the basic characteristics, let's go ahead and jump into the main topic of this webinar, and that's helping all ABLE-related stakeholders better understand what is included in this newly published, updated Social Security Administration POMS, right? So first off, what in the world are POMS, right? Well, POMS stands for Program Operations Manual Systems, and they are based upon the law. So these particular POMS are based obviously on the ABLE Act, and in part some of the guidance that was established by other federal agencies, specifically the Department of Treasury and IRS. And these POMS act as an operational policy reference used by Social Security Administration internal staff to conduct Social Security business. So basically, it is instructions to Social Security staff on how to interpret and how to treat ABLE programs, ABLE accounts, and funds in those ABLE accounts. So this particular document, on the left hand of the screen there, you see all the formal nomenclature, all the formal titles of this particular document if you ever wanted to look it up there. It's Program Operations Manual System, Part 5, concentrating on Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, and it focuses on resources exclusions for the most part. And again, SSA's recently published an updated version of their ABLE POMS. The title is Resources Exclusion and focuses again on supplemental security income. So while a lot of the stuff that we're going to be going over within this guidance is applicable to ABLE accounts and ABLE programs in general, it's really more pointed towards beneficiaries of supplemental security income who are also ABLE account owners. Now, it's important to note for those out there, Not every ABLE account owner will also be on SSI, but because of some of the eligibility criteria, many will be. And in fact, I would venture to say over 30% of current ABLE account owners are actually SSI beneficiaries. So while this is not necessarily applicable to all ABLE account owners, it certainly is applicable to many of them, which is why it's so important to understand exactly what's in this document. So, speaking of, what exactly is in this document? These particular POMs have been broken down into 7 different categories or sections. We're going to be taking these one by one and taking you through what each of them say, and then trying to break that down into language that's easily digestible, easily understood. And then at the end we'll talk about, once we kind of brush through everything, what's really important, what are the main themes that somebody should take away from this guidance. And again, you have to keep in mind, this is a document that is meant to be read by Social Security administrative staff, right? So it's not addressed, its audience is not necessarily, certainly not the public and folks like that, but it's important that folks understand what's in it. So just very quickly, the sections that the POMs are broken down into and that will dictate how we go through this webinar are as follows. Number 1, they want to explain what is an ABLE account. Number 2, they want to provide to their staff a definition of ABLE terms. Number 3, they talk about when to exclude ABLE account contributions, balances, earnings, and distributions. Number 4, they talk about when to count ABLE account balances and distributions. They talk about, number 5, how to verify, document, and record ABLE account balances. Number 6, how to verify, document, and record ABLE account distributions. And lastly, there's a section in there on how SSA should be handling and recording ABLE prepaid debit card information. So that's kind of a tool provided by many ABLE programs that help people more readily access the funds in their account for those that want to use the funds in the account on a more frequent basis. So Social Security has a section on those as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and break down this document. That's about 19 pages long. We're going to start going through it here. So how do they define what an ABLE account is? Well, they define it as the Achieving a Better Life Experience account, or ABLE account, is a type of tax advantage savings account that an eligible individual can use to pay for qualified disability expenses. This is exactly what we went over previously. They also note that the eligible individual is the owner and designated beneficiary of the account, just like we pointed out earlier, and that an eligible individual may establish an ABLE account provided that the individual is either blind or disabled by a condition that began before the individual's 26th birthday. So that speaks a little bit to how we talked about these ABLE accounts, unfortunately, are not accessible to all people with disabilities, but that there are eligibility requirements that need to be met in order to be allowed to open up an ABLE account, and thus for the funds contributed into the ABLE account to be not taken into consideration when determining eligibility, and in this instance for SSI. And we'll talk about that. They get into the details that in a slide or two. So the next, under this section, the POMs talk about different types of state ABLE program models. So this is just stating that some states form partnerships to improve access to eligible individuals to enroll in programs, and that their staff should expect to see different types of arrangements between states and ABLE programs, and they provide several different examples on the different formations or the different contracts or the different agreements that states have to provide ABLE programs and ABLE accounts to eligible individuals, just so that folks are understood what those might look like. So those aren't especially important to ABLE account owners or potential ABLE account owners, but are included in those POMs anyways. So they want to understand that it's very important, and I think we might have touched on this earlier, but A designated beneficiary, or the person with a disability, is limited to only one ABLE account. So provided that the person meets the eligibility criteria, they're allowed to enroll in a single program and establish a single ABLE account, and that is it. You are not allowed to have more than one ABLE account. So if I'm eligible, I can not open up an ABLE account in Ohio and then go open up another ABLE account in the state of Virginia through their program. You're only allowed to have one at a time. There is a slight exception when you roll over, which you are allowed to do from one program to another. There might be a short period of time in which you technically have two, but that cannot last for more than a very short period of time. You would have had to transfer those funds over. So that's important to note. And if there are more than one, then one of those will not be, will have the protection that is typically provided by an ABLE account. So they want to make sure that folks understand that, or their staff understands that. They want to make sure that folks understand the Medicaid reimbursement portion of the ABLE Act, which says that upon the death of a designated beneficiary, funds that remain in the ABLE account after payments of all outstanding qualified disability expenses must be used to reimburse the state for medical assistance, or Medicaid, benefits that the designated beneficiary receives if, that means provided that, the state files a claim for that reimbursement. So that's applicable to all ABLE accounts for the most part, and that's called the Medicaid reimbursement clause. It's important to note the things you want to take away from this is really the statement that it says if the state files a claim. The federal law does not mandate or obligate the state to file a claim. It simply allows them to do so. Some states have moved forward on passing state legislation that prohibits their Medicaid state agency from filing that claim. But at this point, I would just, what I typically tell folks is, ABLE is an incredible tool to build assets without losing or jeopardizing an individual's supports and services provided through programs that have resource limits like Medicaid and SSI. It's not perhaps a good tool if your primary goal or a top goal of yours is wealth transfer, because this Medicaid reimbursement clause does exist, and you can't expect that in all likelihood it will be enforced. So that's important to know. So the next section of the POMS talks about just definitions of ABLE terms. So this provides the Social Security employee the opportunity to better understand what's to come in the POMS as a result of understanding certain terms that will be used in the document. So let's go over those very quickly. What is an ABLE program? Well, an ABLE program is the program established and maintained by a state or an agency or an instrumentality thereof through which eligible individuals can open an ABLE account, right? We've talked about this. There's different ways that ABLE programs can be set up. They're typically found within a state Department of Treasury, although there are some exceptions to that, and there are currently, I believe, 35 different programs across the United States. And it's important also to note, I just want to add that these are established, programs established and maintained by a state, not necessarily a financial institution. So if you are interested in enrolling, you would enroll online and you maintain the account online. You wouldn't get up and walk down to your brick and mortar, Bank of America or Wells Fargo, whatever financial institution, brick and mortar in your neighborhood and say, hey, I want an ABLE account. They likely would have no idea what you're talking about. So it's important to note this is all done online through a state. They want to define what a contribution is. So a contribution is the payment of funds into an ABLE account. Contributions must be made in cash and may be made in form of cash or a check, money order, credit card, electronic transfer, or similar method. What this basically is saying that contributions are made in cash. You cannot put things like property into an ABLE account, whereas you can put property, a house, into a trust. You cannot put that into something like an ABLE account. So that's important to note. Additionally, as I said previously, any person can contribute into an ABLE account. So that includes people, that includes a trust, which is really important to note. That includes a company or a corporation, a person's place of employment, has the ability to contribute into their ABLE account as well. However, again, we touched on this previously, the total annual contributions that an ABLE account can receive from all sources or all contributors is limited to the amount of per donee gift tax exclusions in effect for any given calendar year. That basically means the gift tax exclusion, which is currently set at $15,000. That will be adjusted for inflation from time to time. As an example, last year it was $14,000. This year it's $15,000. What you need to take away from that is anybody can contribute into an ABLE account. However, all contributions combined in any given tax year in 2018 are not to exceed $15,000. Designated beneficiaries. So this is where we talked about, we gave a little bit of information about what that might look like, but this digs into it a little bit more. And again, it's unfortunate, but not all people with disabilities will be provided the opportunity to open up an ABLE account because there are criteria, eligibility criteria. So the designated beneficiary is the individual who owns the ABLE account, we talked about that, and who was an eligible individual when the account was established or who succeeded the former designated beneficiary in that capacity, right? So in order to be an eligible individual, the person with a disability must, 1, be eligible for SSI based on disability or blindness that began before age 26, so they had to have an onset of disability prior to their 26th birthday. 2, be entitled to disability insurance benefits, be that the disability insurance benefits, child disability benefits, or disabled widows or widowers benefits, DWB, based on the disability or blindness that began before age 26. Or they could certify or an agent under their power of attorney, a parent or guardian, that the individual has a medically determined impairment meeting statutorily specified criteria or is blind, and that disability or blindness occurred before age 26. That's what we typically talk about as a disability certification, wherein they would need to go to a physician. The physician would have to document their disability and sign off that they meet those particular criteria. So that's important to know in terms of who is eligible to open up an ABLE account and thus be provided the benefits that are associated with being an ABLE account owner. They wanted to also remind folks that just because you are eligible for an ABLE account does not necessarily mean that you're entitled to Social Security disability benefits. It doesn't work that way. Even though in some circumstances, because you're entitled or because you're a beneficiary of Social Security disability benefits, you can open an ABLE account, it doesn't work the other way. So that's important. Just because you have an ABLE account doesn't mean you can go knocking on SSA's door and say, I have an ABLE account, therefore I should be eligible for SSI or SSDI. It doesn't work that way, and they wanted to make sure that their folks understand that. Distributions. So a distribution is any payment from an ABLE account, right? So any time that an individual takes money, for the most part, out of the ABLE account, that's considered what's called a distribution. The designated beneficiary or the person with signature authority determines when a distribution is made, right? So that's important. That is an interesting differentiation to special needs trust, wherein you have trustees, you have to request funds and things like that. That's not the case with ABLE. It goes to my point earlier that it provides a designated beneficiary, the person with a disability, the account owner, with much more autonomy with respect to using the money and having control of the money. So that's an important thing to understand about ABLE, and in my opinion, in many circumstances, a great benefit. Also, distributions may be made only to or for the benefit of the designated beneficiary. So that's important to note. That you can't use those funds for the benefit of other people. They have to be used for your benefit, right? Okay. Member of family. So this is going to come back, and we'll point out why this is important in a little while. But the term member of family means a member of the designated beneficiary's family, means a sibling, whether that be by blood or adoption, and includes a brother, sister, stepbrother, stepsister, half-brother, half-sister. And in a little bit, you'll see why that's important. But when you see that term, now you know exactly what that's talking about. So that's how it's defined within the ABLE Act. So again, we talked just briefly at the beginning of the presentation about what this signature authority is, but it's also included within the POM so that Social Security employees understand what it means. And they define it as such: a person with signature authority can establish and administer an ABLE account for a designated beneficiary who is a minor child or is otherwise incapable of managing the account, right? But at the same time, signature authority is not the equivalent of ownership. So even if somebody has signature authority over somebody's account, that does not mean that the person with a disability is not the account owner. In all circumstances, the person with a disability who's the designated beneficiary is the account owner. Those three things are the exact same people always. The person with a disability, the beneficiary of the account, and the owner of the account, always the same person under all circumstances. Additionally, the person with signature authority must be, number one, the designated beneficiary's agent acting under power of attorney, or if none, a parent or a legal guardian of the designated beneficiary. Again, we talked about that earlier on in the presentation. It also says for SSI purposes, or supplemental security income purposes, always consider the designated beneficiary to be the owner of the ABLE account, regardless of whether someone else has signature authority over it. It just restipulates what we just talked about there. It also talks about a program-to-program transfer, and what that is. It basically means that the law allows for the entire balance of an ABLE account to be transferred from one program to another program. This offers the individual the ability to change programs if they find another program that they feel best meets their needs. It also allows for the change of the beneficiary, and that's where a family member comes into play here. The law says that part or all of the balance to an ABLE account of an eligible individual who is a family member of the designated beneficiary would constitute a program-to-program transfer as well. And again, that family member doesn't mean anybody related to that person. Remember, we had that very strict definition that only included siblings, be that brother, sister, stepbrother, stepsister, half-brother, half-sister. So those are the kinds of people that you can transfer funds into, provided that that individual is also a designated beneficiary, meaning they meet the eligibility to open up an ABLE account. Okay. Next, they wanted to make sure that folks understood what exactly this term qualified disability expense means. These are what the funds can be spent on, and this is very important to understand. And it states that the qualified disability expenses are expenses related to that individual's blindness or disability and are for the benefit of the designated beneficiary, and that help them increase or maintain their health, independence, or quality of life. That's what a QDE is. It provides for various what I call buckets or categories that these QDEs might fall under. And they include the list on the screen there: education, housing, transportation, employment and training, support, assistive technology, personal support services, health, prevention and wellness, financial management, legal fees, expenses for ABLE account oversight and monitoring, funeral and burial expenses, and even includes basic living expenses. So quite a wide range of different things in which these ABLE funds are allowed to be used for. And that's important to know because we wanted to make sure when we were advising Congress and those that made this guidance about what these funds should be able to be used for, we wanted to make sure it was as broad as possible because we appreciate the wide array of different needs of people with disabilities, especially those with the types of disabilities that meets the severity criteria that would be needed to be met in order to be allowed to have an ABLE account. It goes on to define housing expenses, saying that housing expenses for the purposes of an ABLE account are similar to household costs for in-kind support and maintenance purposes with the exception of food. So then it gives examples of what might be considered housing expenses, of which ABLE funds can be used for housing expenses. So that means mortgage, real property taxes, rent, heating, fuel, gas, electricity, water, sewer, and garbage removal is how they define housing expenses. Housing expenses are a broader term under ABLE that are typically talked about when articulating or describing what ABLE funds can be used for, and certainly is has much relevance that we'll see later on in these slides. Rollover. Rollover is the contribution to an ABLE account of a designated beneficiary of all or a portion of an amount withdrawn from a designated beneficiary's ABLE account, provided that the contribution is made within 60 days of that withdrawal. So this just is a definition that allows for a rollover, the type that we described previously. So the next section of the POMs start to get into the weeds a bit, but it's very important to understand these. And they talk, the next section talks about when to exclude ABLE account contributions, balances, earning, and distributions when deciding the eligibility of an individual for SSI. So, exclude contributions as income. So it states, or it dictates to the Social Security Administrator that a payment made into an ABLE account constitutes a contribution. Consider the contribution made by the person to whom the funds belong or are due. Exclude contributions to an ABLE account from the income of the designated beneficiary. Excluded contributions include rollovers from a family member account to an SSI applicant, recipient, or deemer's ABLE account. So basically what this means is do not take into consideration funds contributed into an ABLE account as income. So this goes to, again, one of the greatest things about an ABLE account, wherein an individual can save significant amounts of money and can be given significant amounts of money provided that it goes into their ABLE account without jeopardizing or being included in terms of income and resources. Now, that being said, there's a note on here. It says that the fact that a person uses his or her own income to contribute to an ABLE account does not mean that his or her income is not countable for SSI purposes as it normally would be. Income received by the designated beneficiary and then deposited into their ABLE account is still income by the designated beneficiary. So what in the world are they talking about? Well, ABLE account is an excellent tool for building assets and getting around, to a certain extent, resource limits that are established by federally funded means test benefits such as Medicaid and certainly SSI, right? But it does not help in terms of earned income, or what's called SGA, substantial gainful activity. So typically you have two tests, well, in terms of means tests when it comes to resources and income, divided into your assets and divided into your income. ABLE addresses income and ABLE addresses resource and assets, not income. So even if I am an ABLE account owner, and let's say I have employment and I'm earning money, even if I take the money that I'm earning directly from my paycheck and put it into my ABLE account, that earning is still counted as income, right, for purposes of substantial gainful activity. And then it goes into the ABLE account. It can roll over into the next month, of which we'll discuss here in a little bit, and you'll see that it's not counted as a resource, but it can be counted as income. So let's dig into this just a little further. We can divide contributions into first-party contributions and third-party contributions. We're going to talk about first-party contributions here just for a second. So this is a contribution made by the designated beneficiary, so the person with a disability themselves, into their own ABLE account, and it is not income to the designated beneficiary. However, income received by the designated beneficiary and deposited into his or her ABLE account is income to the designated beneficiary, right? So that's a confusing sentence. So if it's income to the individual and then they put it in, it's income. But if it's just resources of an individual that they have and then put into the ABLE account, it is not, right? So I hope that's not too confusing. Again, it just goes back to the fact that ABLE is not a way to avoid income counting. It's a way to build assets and collect resources without bumping into those resource and asset limits that are often imposed on people who are beneficiaries of SSI and Medicaid and other federally funded means-tested benefits, right? Okay. So it goes further to talk about the different types of examples of payments that even could be directly deposited into an ABLE account, but that are still counted as income as they otherwise would be. They include wages. Obviously, this is something that we talked about with my example. If the individual has employment, even if it's going directly from their paycheck into the ABLE account, it's still counted in terms of income. It's not counted as an asset. It's counted as income. It also includes benefit payments, and this is a new one because I've gotten a lot of questions about this, it includes mandatory support payments such as child support or alimony. So if an individual is getting child support, even if it's directly deposited into the ABLE account, it's still counted as income in that month and could, as a result, jeopardize the individual's eligibility for SSI. Third-party contributions, this just means contributions made by a person other than the account owner themselves, is basically all that means. And those funds are not counted as income, provided that, again, they're not in lieu or supposed to be wages or things like that. It's important to note on this page that even third-party contributions can even include not only contributions made by friends and family, but can also be made by funds that are being held within a trust, of which the designated beneficiary is also the beneficiary of that particular trust. So that's an important thing. I know there were a lot of questions about that. That is allowed, and those funds would not be counted as income when distributed from that individual's trust into their ABLE account. Okay. So when to exclude ABLE account earnings. So this is an interesting thing, and not a lot of people, I feel, recognize this, and it's important to understand this. We often describe ABLE accounts as a savings account, but in fact what it really is, it's actually an investment account. So when a person, in most circumstances, when a person is enrolling into an ABLE program, they're going to be provided a slew of different investments in which to choose. And once they choose an investment or a combination of investments, the contributions made into the account will be directed in that direction. And provided that the investment is a good one and that we're in a good market, it will yield interest. It will accrue interest. So it will have earnings or dividends, right? So maybe you contribute in a year $10,000 and the final, and then 3 years later that $10,000 is actually $13,000. And you've grossed or you've earned interest of, $3,000 or whatever that is. Social Security wants to make sure that you understand that even those earnings on the contributions made should not be counted as earnings with respect to eligibility for SSI. And in fact, other programs have said the same thing. So they direct the Social Security Administrator to exclude earnings on ABLE account received from the income of the designated beneficiary. So it's not counted. So again, contributions made into an ABLE account, provided that they're not coming from earnings made by the beneficiary, are not taken into consideration and are excluded, as are whatever the principal or the original contribution into the account as a result of being invested. If they earn, those are not counted either. So that's important to know. So this is a very important slide here. We describe these ABLE accounts as providing an opportunity to save funds without jeopardizing eligibility for most federally funded means-tested benefits, right? The reason why we say most is because there is an exclusion, and that only relates to this particular population that we're talking about right now, which is, again, folks that have an ABLE account and are also receiving SSI or supplemental security income benefits And what the law says, and it's reiterated in these POMs, is that you only exclude the first $100,000 within the ABLE account. So exclude up to and including $100,000 of the balance of funds in an ABLE account from the resources of the designated beneficiary. So once an individual starts to breach that, those dollars are going to start being counted against the individual with respect to resource and asset limits. Now, nobody's hit this $100,000 mark yet because, as we discussed previously, these programs have only been around for about 2 years, and when you have those annual contribution limits set at $14,000 in 2017 and $15,000 this year, people just haven't had the opportunity to get to $100,000 yet. But it's important to note that for beneficiaries of SSI, they need to pay attention to when their accounts might be approaching $100,000, because only that $100,000 will be excluded in terms of resources. So let's talk about the next slide, talking about do not count ABLE account distributions as income, right? So a distribution from an ABLE account is not income, but is a conversion of a resource from one form to another. So when an individual takes funds out of the account, that in and of itself does not count as a resource because it goes in 1 month, it comes out in the same month. Do not count distributions from an ABLE account as income of the designated beneficiary, regardless of whether the distribution is for a qualified disability expenses not related to housing, for housing expenses, or even for a non-qualified expense. So just taking the money out in and of itself is not going to affect anything. It goes even further in saying exclude retained distributions for QDEs not related to housing. We'll talk about the whole housing thing later. So this is when things start to matter, and that's when assets are retained, right? So it says exclude a distribution for a qualified disability-related expense not related to housing from the designated beneficiary's countable resource if he or she retains it beyond the month in which the individual receives it. So the exclusion applies to, so if you pull it out and you retain it lasting into the month following, it is excluded provided that the designated beneficiary maintains or keeps or makes contributions to or receives distributions from the ABLE account. The distribution is unspent, the distribution is identifiable, and the individual intends to use the distributions for a qualified disability-related expense that is not related to housing. So you can even take it out of the ABLE account. It can sit somewhere, although we don't necessarily recommend that because it gets a little, it could get difficult to track the funds. But as long as you take it out of the ABLE account still exists. It can sit there unspent as long as you can identify those ABLE dollars. So I wouldn't go putting it in a checking account that's mixing with other types of dollars. And that you have the intention to use it for a QDE. Under all those circumstances, it's still not counted as a resource. So that's pretty incredible. And that's important to know. Okay. So let's talk about a little bit about when SSA does count ABLE account balances and distributions. Well, again, they count ABLE account balances. Again, anything over $100,000 in the ABLE account is counted. That's important. We just talked about that. And let's talk about specifically what happens when an SSI recipient's ABLE account breaches $100,000. And this is what happens here. This is the rule right here. A special rule applies when the balance of an SSI recipient's ABLE account exceeds $100,000 by an amount that causes the recipient to exceed the SSI resource limit, which is typically $2,000, whether alone or with other resources. So that's important to note. When this situation happens, SSA will place the recipient into a special SSI suspension. And what happens during that suspension? Well, they will suspend the recipient's SSI benefit without time limit as long as he or she remains otherwise eligible. the recipient is still SSI eligible for Medicaid. So that's important. Even if the individual breaches this $100,000 cap and their SSI benefit is temporarily suspended, their Medicaid still remains intact. So that's important to note. And what makes this suspension different from other suspensions that are often found under SSI is the fact that it can be, the individual's benefit can be suspended indefinitely, provided that the cap is still being broke. That means that it could go, you could go 24 months and you would still be eligible, you'd still be receiving your Medicaid and things like that, and you would still, you wouldn't have to reapply, wherein in many circumstances there is a 12-month termination. After 12 months of being over-resourced, your eligibility would then be terminated and you would have to reapply and things like that. That's not the case with ABLE. So that's another important distinction, and certainly something that people who are ABLE account owners who are also SSI beneficiaries should pay close attention to if or when the ABLE account starts to get up there to $100,000. And we can talk a little bit more about this with one of our guest experts as to what ABLE programs might have in mind in terms of making sure that SSI beneficiaries who might be approaching this limit, what their options are and how they will be notified. Additionally, even if you breach the $100,000 and your SSI cash benefit is suspended, as soon as it falls back below, SSA will reinstate the recipient's regular SSI eligibility for all months in which the individual's account balance is no longer causes the recipient to exceed the resource limit and that he or she would otherwise be eligible. Okay. Ineligibility due to excess resources other than ABLE, obviously, just because you have an ABLE account doesn't allow you to go break any other SSI rules with respect to being eligible. And even if you have $150,000 in your ABLE account, obviously your SSI would go under that special suspension that we just described. But outside of that, you are not allowed to break the other typical rules. So let's say you had $150,000 in your ABLE account and $3,000 in your checking account. Well, that $3,000 in your checking account in and of itself may disqualify you in terms of eligibility, and thus you would be terminated in many circumstances. You would be suspended from your benefit and you would be subject to your typical SSI rules. And then again, ineligible for other reasons. Just because you have an ABLE account does not mean you can go do anything. You still have to abide by the typical rules that would allow you to be eligible for SSI. Okay. The next section, count retained distributions for housing expenses or expenses that are not QDEs as a resource. So this is an interesting part, and we're going to dive into this a little more later on in the presentation, but I'll just give you what the POMs say right now. So it directs Social Security to count a distribution for a housing expense or for an expense that is not a QDE as a resource if the designated beneficiary retains the distribution into the month following the month of receipt. So basically what this means is, and don't let this scare you in terms of housing expenses, you can use ABLE dollars to pay for housing expenses. And we defined housing expenses earlier in the earlier slide, so keep that in mind. However, in order to do it in a manner in which is not taken in consideration and that will not affect your eligibility for SSI, you would need to take those funds out and pay for the housing expense in the same month. That's the kicker, and we're gonna. I know our friend Jim is gonna shed some more light on that here in a little bit, but I want folks to understand that, and we're gonna come back to that in a little while. It also states that if the designated beneficiary spends the distribution within the month of the receipt, there is no effect on eligibility. So that's basically the technical language on what I just said. And it goes on to say, however, apply normal SSI resource counting rules and exclusions to items purchased with funds from an ABLE account. Which means, housing expenses aside, if you go using these ABLE funds for things that are not allowed or otherwise not qualified disability expenses, then those will be counted and may affect your eligibility for SSI. So it's important to understand what the funds can be used for, of which is very broad, and understand at the same time what the consequences are for misusing these funds. So as a quick example, we know that all funds in the ABLE account need to be used for the benefit of the beneficiary in addition to the other definitions of QDEs. So I can't go taking funds out of my account and go buy my buddy a car, because that's not for my benefit, right? I can't go buy them something, a gift or something like that. And if I was to do that, then the distribution made for that particular item for a non-qualified disability expense may be counted against me in terms of acting as a resource. Okay. Included in this section under the palms is a section called Count previously excluded distributions used for non-qualified purposes or housing expenses. Again, this is basically what I just said. Count the amount of funds used for a non-qualified expense or housing expense as a resource as of the first moment of the month in which the funds were spent if the designated beneficiary uses the distribution for a non-qualified purpose or housing expense, right? We don't want to do that. Don't spend the funds on a non-qualified purpose. And if you spend it on housing, of which you are allowed to do, make sure you pull the money or you have the distribution in the same month in which you pay for the housing expense. That's basically the takeaway from that. The next section we're going to get through really quickly. It's really mostly for the benefit of the ABLE administrator to let them know what they should be collecting and how to collect it. So it's not that useful for ABLE beneficiaries, but we will touch on it very quickly. So it talks about what evidence should be obtained of the ABLE account. So it states that when an applicant alleges being the designated beneficiary of an ABLE account, SSA will obtain evidence and enter the following information, of which you can see there. If the available evidence does not provide the necessary information, they instruct the SSA representative to contact the appropriate ABLE program to obtain that information to make sure that the benefits that are provided to this beneficiary, to the ABLE account owner, are actually allowable. Because if you're not an ABLE account owner, you can't just have a checking account and call it an ABLE account and expect to have these benefits provided to you in terms of disregarding certain types of funds and distributions, right? It goes on to state that beginning in October 1, 2017, states report the first of the month account balances and the prior month's distribution information to all ABLE accounts in their program to SSA. And we'll talk with we'll talk with Rob, who represents, who helps with these systems here in a little bit about exactly what that looks like, what that entails. This next slide basically just directs Social Security staff to document a lot of this information, obviously. Recording the account on the SSI claim system. So there's a system that SSA built called RABLE, where they put all this information into. It just tells them basically how to complete that page and collect that information and how to put it in there. It reiterates that the designated beneficiary is the account owner, is always the account owner for purposes of SSI. All right. The next slide talks to the different types of information that they're going to be entering. Again, we're going to talk to Rob about this here in a little bit. He's going to give us some more information, but those are just some of the things that they'll be collecting. Next section is how to verify, document, and record ABLE account distributions. Again, this section just talks about how SSA will verify distributions only when an applicant or other evidence indicates that he or she has retained it. So that's important. Again, remember when we talked about distributions in and of themselves may not constitute a resource, but when they're retained, that's when things really kick in, and that's when they got to pay attention to how it was used, what it was used on, and things like that to determine whether it should be counted or not. They also state that the distribution is material only to determine whether the applicant's countable resources exceed the resource limit, since distributions in and of themselves do not count as income. So this goes back to what we were talking about. They also need to verify the distribution. This talks about how SSA will obtain evidence that shows distribution amounts, distribution dates, distribution receipts, and that they will obtain and accept the applicant's allegation that he or she used it or intends to use the distributions for one qualified disability expense that's not housing, a housing expense, or an expense that is not QDE. So that will determine how they interpret that particular that particular expense as to whether or not they're going to count it as a resource. So that's vital information that they need to know. Again, SSA will exclude any retained distributions or part of a distribution for QDE not related to housing from the designated beneficiaries' countable resources. So that in and of itself, that is the big thing, right? That's what makes it so special. Not only will they not count the funds contributed into the account, but they are not going to count the funds taken out provided that they're spent on qualified disability expenses. So that's what makes this extremely special. But then it dictates when to count those. Again, this just reiterates a lot of things that we talked about in the previous slides. Count previously excluded distributions used for non-qualified purposes in housing. Again, people need to understand what these funds can be used for and what they cannot be used for, because there are consequences on misusing these funds, and they can, if misused, affect an individual's eligibility for extremely important and vital supports and services provided through programs such as Social Security Administration's SSI program and Medicaid. Because remember, it's not just that cash benefit that we're talking about. In many circumstances, an individual's eligibility to SSI entitles them to access to Medicaid, which provides an abundance of supports and services to people with disabilities that they otherwise cannot get anywhere else. So this is all very important. This page just indicates how they should record the excluded amounts on the appropriate resource page. So again, this is very specific information to be used by the Social Security representative who is collecting this information. And then lastly, this is a new section. Again, if I didn't mention this previously, these are updated POMs. Social Security established their original POMs a while back, but felt need to update them based on some changes within the law and how these programs operate. This section is a completely new section provided because many of the ABLE programs are now providing a prepaid debit card option for individuals who are ABLE account owners who may want to access the funds in their accounts a little more readily. So they go into talking about how to handle ABLE prepaid debit cards. And it states that some ABLE programs provide designated beneficiaries with a prepaid debit card, like we just discussed, which may be used to control the issuance of distributions and provide designated beneficiaries with convenient access to their ABLE funds, like we just talked about. It states that SSA will receive information about distributions via a data exchange that indicates when monies are loaded onto the ABLE prepaid card. We'll talk about what that looks like in a little bit. It also talks about handling ABLE debit cards in the SSI claim system, and states that if a designated beneficiary has an ABLE prepaid card, SSA will record the ABLE prepaid card on the, quote, other resource page in SSA claim system, and SSA will need the program state and account number. So these are just details, obviously, that probably aren't that important to an ABLE account beneficiary, but we wanted to be thorough so that people were understanding how SSA is handling ABLE accounts, because I think that's important. Okay, oh my goodness, wow, that was a lot of information there, and I sincerely hope that I did not cause more confusion than things that I hope that I cleared up. But the main takeaways from all this technical information is that funds contributed into an ABLE account are disregarded in terms of eligibility for SSI, provided that they're not income made by the beneficiary, because that still counts as income and earned income, and that provided that and that the earnings or the interest made by the dollars that are contributed in the ABLE account, those are disregarded as well. And the distributions made are disregarded, provided that they're spent on things that they're supposed to be spent on. That's kind of the nuts and bolts what it comes down to. But for me, one of the greatest ways to take all this kind of jargony, in-depth information and really bring it to light in a way that I think is most digestible is to provide different types of examples. And for that reason, we've brought on to the webinar Mr. Jim Shelton, who is just an outstanding expert in terms of benefits, but specifically has dedicated a significant amount of time to putting together examples and hypothetical scenarios in which really illustrate the benefits of ABLE, and specifically how ABLE interacts with various means-tested benefits such as SSI. He's done such a great job that we've actually even contracted with him at the ABLE National Resource Center to do these ABLE case summary series that he's going to tell you a little bit about now, and he's going to provide some examples that are applicable to the information that were included in the POM. So with that, Jim, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you taking the time, and I'm going to turn it over to you to tell us a little bit more about the project that you're doing for the ABLE National Resource Center, and then to provide an example, a profile that will hopefully bring to light some of the stuff that I tried to get through today.
Okay, so thank you very much, Chris, and good afternoon to everyone. Chris, if you could go to the next slide, since I think you're still in charge of moving this slide. Great. Purpose of the series. Chris has really summarized most of what is on this slide. I'll just say that what I'm really trying to do in these case summary series, as I often do in training or articles, is to try to bring ABLE accounts to life by creating any number of case scenarios involving people, different disabilities, different ages. And so over time, if you keep going on the ABLE National Resource Center, you'll begin to see how this plays out with different folks, different types of benefits, different circumstances. And the very first ABLE summary series, and we'll get to the scenario in just a second, focuses almost exclusively on SSI. The second one, which was just recently released, focuses on really a range of benefits and uses, if I recall, a couple of scenarios to go through that. And then there's going to be one released at the end of May that puts the case scenario in the context of a person that might have both a trust and perhaps is looking at an ABLE account. So it's just one of many resources you'll find on the National Resource Center site. So Chris, if you could go to the next slide. And before I get into one, let me just say, part of the purpose of this is to make sure people understand how it interacts with other benefits so they don't make a bad decision and maybe screw up one of those benefit programs. The good news I can offer is that with the exception of that $100,000 SSI resource exclusion limitation, most of the news to date is good news in terms of the way other programs are treating ABLE accounts. So we want to provide good information so that people don't shy away from them, because you can have an ABLE account and SSI. You can have an ABLE account and Medicaid. And you can have an ABLE account and benefit from any number of other benefits. So this is a summary, and it's really only part of what you'd find in case summary number 1, but it'll give you a bit of a flavor, and it'll put some of what Chris has been talking about into context. So let's just kind of read along to set the stage. Wanda is age 16. She's got an intellectual disability and currently spends her time in either primarily special education classes, or you might want to assume some combination of mainstream and special education. She has a long-term goal of supported employment. For those of you not familiar with that model, it probably involves some kind of extra services to help her work despite a disability. Often that's job coaching. Now, Wanda lost SSI at age 11 due to parental income. And part of the lesson here is to let people know that a lot of kids will not be eligible for SSI right now because the SSI program counts parental income until age 18. So in her case, the ABLE account was established in October 2016. That's really the first year that ABLE accounts began to roll out. And as of February of this year, let's assume that she's got $16,500 in the account, and that her parents have indicated they plan to put $3,000 to $4,000 per year into the account. And Wanda is once again going to be eligible for SSI at age 18. Why? Because at age 18, the SSI program, and this is a national rule, they'll no longer count parental income. So a lot of what her parents are going to ask about, and Wanda too, is, so how is this ABLE account going to affect her potential SSI eligibility at age 18 and going forward? So let's go to the next one, Chris. Next slide? Okay, great. So on this slide and the next one, we're just going to go through some of the questions you might anticipate about the ABLE account from Wanda and her parents. And the first question is, must the ABLE account be reduced below $2,000 to be SSI eligible? $2,000 is the resource limit for SSI. You're always looking to see if a resource might be exempt. Well, the good news is it doesn't have to be below $2,000, and just to reiterate what Chris said, up to $100,000 in that ABLE account is going to be an exempt resource. And nobody's going to be close to that amount for some years to come, we would assume, unless their investments make a monumental amount of income. The next question they ask, can ABLE account funds be used to pay for her future apartment? Yes. Housing costs are a qualified disability expense. So think back to what Chris was talking about. When an ABLE account pays for housing, it's considered a qualified disability expense. Now here's the biggie. If the ABLE account pays for rent, will the SSI payment be reduced? No. The SSI program will not consider an ABLE account distribution for rent as in-kind support and maintenance, and the SSI payment's going to remain the same. Let's put this into a little bit of context. Historically, and this is the current rule, if some third party pays for an SSI beneficiary's rent or housing expenses, that's going to be considered in-kind support and maintenance. And typically, that SSI payment is subject to a reduction up to $250 a month. So the parents who are contributing to this account, if they paid for Wanda's rent, maybe so she could have a nicer apartment, they could do that, but her SSI payment would be reduced by $250. They take the same $250, put it in the ABLE account, and the ABLE account pays the rent, no impact on SSI at all. So why don't we go on to the next slide, Chris? And if I were presenting to this group live, we'd probably have a long discussion now. can Wanda deposit part of her summer wages into the ABLE account? Yes. She can deposit her own earnings into the account, and in fact, she could, under this amendment to the tax law from December, she could deposit up to $12,000, and actually $12,144 in calendar year 2018. Another important one. How will her deposit of earnings affect her SSI payment amount? And this is where another specialty of mine kind of intersects with this ABLE account. We're going to assume that she earns $600 per month and wants to deposit all of it into the ABLE account. Now, ordinarily, the beneficiary's own income, she can put it into the ABLE account, but it's going to still count toward her SSI payment, subject to the various income exclusion rules. Well, here's a little tidbit. There's a special rule involving the earned income of students if they're under age 22 and full-time students. It allows for an exclusion. That's a misprint. It's not $73.50 per month. It's actually it's a little over $1,700 a month, up to $73.50 per year. So my apologies, Chris, for that mistake. But the point is, if she's earning $600 per month, all of it's excluded, which means she's got some excess funds that she may be able to do something with other than just spend. Perfect example where, because of the student earned income exclusion, she could put all of that $600 a month into the ABLE account without it affecting the overall cash flow. And again, the SSI payment's going to continue despite the extra money she's getting from wages. So, Chris, I think that's just the little tidbit from the first case summary series, and my apologies for that typo there.
That's all right. That's all right. Thanks so much, Jim. We really appreciate it. And I certainly encourage folks to go to the ABLE National Resource Center website and take a look at those. We've published 2 of them so far. They're going to be published, like Jim said, every other month for the remainder of the year. So we'll have a total of 6 of those profiles, case summaries, to present to folks. And they do just an incredibly great job of illustrating the technical side of ABLE, how ABLE funds interact with various different disability-related benefits, not just SSI. And I really enjoy reading the specific hypothetical profiles that really bring to life, at least to me, a lot of what can be considered to sometimes be a little more complex things. So I really appreciate that, Jim. I know we have some questions for you, some more questions for you in a little bit. But before we move on to the Q&A section, I just want to very quickly talk about the ABLE National Resource Center. The ABLE National Resource Center is a collaborative of over 25 of the country's largest disability-related nonprofit organizations. We all came together. The center is run and managed and founded by National Disability Institute. But I encourage folks to go to the website there on your screen, www.ablenrc.org. We have an incredible amount of information related to ABLE. We have short videos. All our webinars that we do are archived there. We have a map of the United States that will tell you where each individual state is with respect to establishing their ABLE accounts or ABLE programs. And then if you click on a state that already has an ABLE program, that page gives you information about the fees associated with that particular program, the investment options associated with that program, and other pieces of information. We even have a tool on there that will help you compare up to 3 different ABLE programs side by side based off of about 10 or 11 different characteristics that we think an individual would want to take into consideration when choosing which program best meets your individual needs. So again, I encourage folks to check out the ABLE National Resource Center by going to that website there. And in addition to that, signing up for our ABLE News Alerts. We have a monthly newsletter that we get out with announcements of various webinars, different activities, different projects that we have, different announcements with respect to different guidances coming out from federal agencies and meetings and things like that. So I encourage folks to check that out. So we got about 10 minutes, and I want to go over to the Q&A. I know that I have some questions that I want to talk to some of our guests about. Let's go ahead and start out with Marlene. She's our Social Security benefits expert here at the National Disability Institute. Marlene, you know, many people have described the benefits that are allowed under the ABLE Act as transformative. Having worked for SSA for a number of years, in which I know you have, and with you being so knowledgeable about the program, Social Security or SSI, could you tell us what is so significant about not counting these funds in an ABLE account when determining eligibility for SSI? Why is that significant? Why is that such a big deal?
Okay, and I'd be happy to comment on that, Chris. But before I do, I just want to thank you and thank Jim for all of the great information you provided. I would swear that in a prior life you both were employed by the Social Security Administration because you both have a great deal of knowledge. So thank you. But I just wanted to say that ABLE has made quite a difference. I wanted to just touch on resources a little. I was going to talk about in-kind support and maintenance just a little, but because our time has been limited, I'll just talk a little bit about resources because Jim touched on that already. Just as a little bit of background, the SSI program, it's a federal program. It provides means-tested benefits, we know, to individuals who are disabled or blind. The program actually requires individuals to remain poor to be eligible for benefits, and we know that that current resource limit is $2,000 for an individual, and it's been that same limit since about 1989 or so, and prior to that, I think it was around $1,500 or so. There's two big significant things that I wanted to talk about. First was initial eligibility. When a person is actually filing for benefits, Social Security actually looks to see if they meet technical requirements, and one of those requirements is resources. So if an individual has over $2,000 in a non-ABLE account, Social Security would never even get to the point where they look at their disability. It just would be an automatic denial. So for persons like that, establishing an ABLE account and possibly saving money in the ABLE account may help them to become eligible for SSI, and we know that in most states with SSI comes Medicaid, and a lot of folks aren't real concerned about that cash benefit, but they really want that Medicaid. So that's really, really great. The other thing I wanted to talk about is looking at someone who's already been receiving supplemental security income benefits for a while. The maximum federal benefit anyone can receive is $750 in a state without supplementation. And as a result of the $2,000 limit on resources and a limited income requirement to qualify for supplemental security income, many individuals, they have a lot of difficulty meeting their needs, let alone building assets. So if a beneficiary has over $2,000 in resources, Social Security would generally see this through one of the data exchanges. I think we'll be touching on that a little bit. And the cash benefit would stop, and then the Medicaid would stop along with that. If they're in that non-paid status for 12 months, then everything would terminate. With ABLE, they could save over $2,000 in the ABLE account. They could set financial goals. They could meet other goals. They could set other goals to meet their needs. I think with greater savings, they might have the funds to meet emergency needs. They can also enhance their quality of life. So kind of in summary, I think those are the most significant things with regards to ABLE. It's been the changes in the SSI program as related to the resources.
Wow, great. Thank you, Marlene. That really does kind of bring it to life. Just to continue, I guess, down that road, we included as part of our guest panel Katie Oliver. Katie is part of our ABLE National Resource Center ABLE Advisor cohort that we just announced just a week or so ago, and she's part of a small group that is acting as national spokespersons for ABLE, and I encourage folks to go to the website and check that out. But Katie, certainly happy to have you with us today. You're an ABLE account owner, and you are part of the ABLE National Resource Center Advisor Group. Would you mind sharing with us just a little bit about yourself and how you came to find out about ABLE and what being an ABLE account owner really means to you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie. I'm 27. I was born with cerebral palsy. I'm in Texas. I have an ABLE account with Ohio. I actually first heard about ANRC through a contact of mine at a vocational rehab service here in Texas who put me in touch with the website, and I was so excited to have all of the information related to all these different states' programs kind of in a centralized place to where you don't have to track down, you know, all these individual programs and see, you know, one at a time, and so you can kind of see everything right there together. In terms of what having an account means to me, I just kind of want to echo what everybody has said. It's really a vehicle for disabled folks to finally have a chance to save for ourselves, to have a stake in our own financial futures, and not just, you know, be subject to decisions that are made by other folks. And I think that that's really empowering for us.
Great, great. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to share your experience with us and tell us a little bit about how ABLE specifically has benefited your life. Now, I did want to follow up with that, Katie. I know that you are very knowledgeable about SSI from a personal standpoint, having been a beneficiary at one time in your life. Would you mind telling us what that is like in terms of trying to save for your future and be on SSI, and how ABLE has changed that?
Sure. I actually received SSI well before ABLE was even a thing. So at that point, saving was quite literally impossible. So I was, once I was employed, which I was, of course, fortunate enough to be, I basically had to, I was in a position where I had to essentially make purchases that I didn't necessarily need to make because of that resource limit people have talked about. And at that time, there was no vehicle to be able to exclude resources. And so it was really frustrating because I sort of felt like I was in a position of, do I save for my future, or do I receive benefits that I need right now? And there wasn't really a vehicle to be able to do both. And so I think that the ABLE accounts are definitely revolutionary in terms of allowing disabled folks to be able to save, as I said.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you for sharing with us, Katie. We're running up against our time, but I want to bring in Rob real quick just for some kind of nuts and bolts of some of the exchanges. Now, Rob, if you could just very quickly, I know that you and Census are one of the most significant behind-the-scenes players in terms of making ABLE Act a reality. First, could you just briefly tell us just a little bit about Census, their overall role in the implementation and program management of ABLE accounts, and what motivated you all to get involved in the ABLE space? And then if you wouldn't mind, just let us know how exactly, give us some examples of information that you provide to Social Security and how you guys do that.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for having me on the webinar. So as Chris mentioned, this is Rob Percival, and I oversee the ABLE product line here at Census. So essentially, we administer retirement accounts, health savings accounts, college savings accounts, and now ABLE accounts. Excuse me. And we were among the first to launch an ABLE platform back in June of 2016 and have ABLE relationships with 19 different states through the Enable program for Nebraska and Alabama, the New York ABLE plan, the Tennessee ABLE plan, and 15 member states of the National ABLE Alliance. The roles that we typically play with ABLE accounts include records administration, website hosting and management, transaction processing, tax and SSA reporting, and customer service. We currently administer over about 6,500 ABLE accounts and have $33 million in assets under administration. So through our market leadership in the 529 college savings space, we already worked with a lot of states in administering their 529 plans. With the intent of the ABLE plans to be structured so similarly to the 529 plans, it was a very natural extension of our capabilities to get into the ABLE account administration space. And it also fits very well into our overall corporate mission of helping American families save for their most important needs. As you talked about in the presentation, there are a lot of data points that we share on a monthly basis with the SSA, and so I'll just kind of briefly run through those. So we do provide the account owner's name, their social security number, and their birth date. Then we show the state that the ABLE program is sponsored by. We include the account number for that account, the date that the account was open, and if applicable, the date that it was closed, the name of anyone with signature authority over the account if it's different than the account owners, and then we list off any withdrawals that occurred from the account during that prior month, and then finally the account's balance at the end of the month. So those are really at a high level the data points that we share with the SSA each month. We worked with the SSA throughout the first half of 2017 and began providing the data to them in October of 2017. And the data is generally sent within about the first week of each month, again, reflecting data from the previous month end. The way that we get the information to the SSA is through a secure data feed that was established based on criteria that was prescribed by the SSA.
Okay, wow, that sounds like a lot of information. We certainly appreciate you guys playing such a significant role in ABLE and setting up all the systems behind the scenes in order to help these programs meet their obligations to the various federal agencies that they need to get information to and to abide by the law. It looks like we have run over time. I know this was a lot of information, and I know that we got quite a few questions in through the Q&A portal, and I apologize for not getting to those, but I tell you what we're going to do. As always, we will be archiving this webinar on the ABLE National Resource Center website along with the slides, so folks can review that. We're going to go ahead and we'll print out all the questions that were submitted. We'll do our best to start knocking out those questions, and we will post that document on the same page that the webinar is posted on, and we're going to do our best to get through as many questions as we can by this time next week, and we'll post them up there. So I encourage folks to go to that page this time next week, and hopefully with any luck you will be able to not only have access to this recorded webinar, but access to the slides and access to a document that will have answers for your, let's see here, over 50 questions that were submitted. Again, I apologize we didn't have time to get those, get around to those, but we will make an effort to get those answered and posted on the website as soon as we can. With that, thank you to everybody who was able to attend the webinar, and certainly thank you so much to Marlene, Katie, Rob, and Jim for lending their expertise and their input on today's topic. Stay tuned for other announcements with regard to other webinars, and again, I encourage folks to check out the ABLE National Resource Center. And with that, we will say goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your day.